My name is Amber Dawson. I'm 34 years old, and the morning my sister called to tell me our father was dead. He was sitting 3 feet away from me stealing bacon off my breakfast plate. It was 6:30 on a quiet morning when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, saw Simone, and answered without a second thought. "Morning, sis." Her voice was flat, cold as a bank statement. "Dad died last night. He left everything to me and Braden. You get nothing." I silently placed the call on speaker. In the background, my brother-in-law Braden laughed before adding, "Finally. You're out." Across the table, my father calmly set down his coffee mug, leaned toward the phone, and whispered something that Simone didn't get to hear that morning. "Don't worry. You'll hear those words exactly where she finally did." But here's what none of them knew. The funeral they were already counting inheritance money over was happening that Sunday, and my father had personally chosen every detail himself, right down to the flowers. Lilies. My mother hated lilies. Dad only smiled and said, "She won't mind missing this one." Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally speak loud enough to be heard, with dignity, not revenge. We tell stories about family betrayal and justice earned the right way, for everyone who's ever been underestimated at their own kitchen table. If that sounds like you, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Now let me take you back 9 months earlier to October 2025, when my biggest problem was juggling another travel nursing contract. I'm a registered nurse based out of Columbus, Ohio, working 13-week assignments wherever the pay was best. That's how a girl from Cedar Falls pays off nursing school loans before turning 40. My father loved teasing me about it. "You'll drive 3 states away to hand strangers their pills," he'd laugh. "But I can't convince you to change my furnace filter." That was Moses Dawson, 73 years old that autumn, an Army veteran who served from 1970 to 1974 before spending decades with grease under his fingernails. He worked as a mechanic until 1981, then opened Dawson's Garage on Route 9, running it for 36 years before retiring in 2017. He never chased luxury. He stayed in the same house on Maple Ridge Road that he and my mother, Carol, bought in 1984 and paid off in 2009. He wasn't flashy rich. He was something rarer, debt-free rich. The kind of wealth that doesn't show in a man's shoes but quietly appears years later in courthouse records. Mom passed away in March 2023, and Dad grieved the same way he repaired engines. Quietly, patiently, without asking anyone to watch. Every Saturday evening, he wound the little brass clock on the mantel because Mom always insisted a stopped clock made a house feel dead. He still drove the 1978 Ford F-150 he'd rebuilt bolt by bolt, still called me every Sunday, and I never missed returning the call. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady. Then one bright October afternoon, everything changed. Dad climbed a ladder to clean his own gutters because asking for help had never been one of his talents. He fell 8 feet, landed badly, and shattered his right wrist. Plates, screws, 6 to 8 weeks of healing. Painful but far from life-threatening. I was halfway through a contract in Texas, yet I was back in Cedar Falls within 48 hours because that's what daughters do. When I walked into his hospital room, Simone was already there, holding flowers almost as carefully arranged as her tears. Her husband, Braden, was enthusiastically shaking the surgeon's hand as though he'd just closed on another property. Braden sold mortgages for a living. He had a voice like warm syrup and the kind of polished handshake that felt rehearsed. "You get back to your patients, Amber," he told me, squeezing my shoulder. "Family takes care of family." At the time it sounded generous. Months later, I realized it was a man quietly assigning himself the keys. Before leaving, I asked the questions any nurse would ask. I wanted to review Dad's discharge paperwork, medication list, follow-up appointments, and recovery plan. Braden smiled confidently. "Already handled. Everything's organized at the house." Simone chimed in with a reassuring smile. "We've got this, sweetie. You're so far away." Dad, cheerful and groggy from medication, lifted his good hand in a thumbs up. "Go on, kiddo. I'm surrounded by professionals. So I flew back to Texas. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because the two people standing closest to my father convinced me everything was under control. What I didn't know was that one of them had already decided exactly how much control he intended to take. By November, Dad had moved into Simone and Braden's house, supposedly for just a few weeks until the cast came off. That's when the first document appeared, the completely legal one. His right hand was immobilized. He couldn't drive, write checks, or manage his usual paperwork, so Braden arranged for a notary, and Dad signed a limited power of attorney authorizing nothing more than paying bills while his wrist healed. Seemed sensible, ordinary, harmless. None of us realized that one perfectly reasonable favor would become the first domino to fall. The power of attorney authorized only one thing: paying Dad's bills while his broken wrist healed, using his awkward left hand instead of his dominant right. I want you to hear me clearly because this part matters. That document was completely legal, perfectly reasonable, and unbelievably ordinary. Your own mother might have signed one. I would have. That's exactly how situations like this begin. They don't start with a crime, they start with a favor. That same week, Simone posted a smiling photo of Dad sitting at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup in front of him. The caption read, "Blessed to care for my daddy. Family is everything." It collected more than 200 likes, and half of Cedar Falls filled the comments with hearts and praise. Meanwhile, during one of our Sunday phone calls, Braden casually referred to the Maple Ridge house, the home my parents had worked decades to pay off, as the asset. He said it the way someone comments on the weather without even thinking. I noticed immediately. "You mean the house?" "Yes." He laughed. "Realtor brain." "Sorry." Dad noticed things too, though he didn't tell me until much later. He remembered Braden bringing the power of attorney papers to his bedside instead of letting him sit comfortably at the kitchen table. He remembered the pen already being uncapped before he even looked at the paperwork. His wrist throbbed, the pain medication left him foggy, and the document clearly stated, "Bill paying only." He read it twice before signing. It was the last paper they ever honestly explained before asking for his signature. After that, the wall between us went up one polite brick at a time. Every Sunday my calls stopped reaching Dad and started landing with Simone instead. "He's napping." "He's tired, hun. I'll tell him you called." 3 straight weeks passed without hearing my father's actual voice. Then I was told his old flip phone had broken. I bought him a brand new smartphone, programmed my number into it, and shipped it directly to Simone's house. The package mysteriously disappeared. I bought a second one, this time with tracking. The delivery confirmation said it arrived. "Oh," Simone told me casually. "Dad didn't want it. You know how he is with technology." My father rebuilt the carburetor of a classic truck at 70 years old. He wasn't intimidated by a mobile phone. That's when I knew something was wrong, and I want that on the record. I asked to speak with him directly. I offered to schedule a video call. I asked which doctor was treating his wrist so I could contact the office myself. Every single request hit the same soft wall. "He's resting. We've got everything under control. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Here's what no one tells you about situations like ours. When a mentally competent adult has caregivers insisting everything is fine, a daughter living 2 states away has almost no leverage. There's no government office you call because your sister keeps answering the phone. I was locked into a 13-week nursing contract with student loans still hanging over my head, while the only 2 people inside that house kept smiling through every lie. One Sunday, Simone ended our conversation with words I've never forgotten. "You chose your career, Amber. Let the people who stayed handle it." I flew home for Christmas anyway. The moment I walked into her house, something felt wrong. Dad's chair had been moved from the center of the family to the corner of the room. Christmas 2025 had arrived. Dad had turned 74, the cast was finally gone, but something else had been wrapped around him instead. A quiet, shrinking version of himself. He sat in the corner while Simone answered questions that people directed to him. "Dad's wrist is healing beautifully, isn't it, Daddy?" she chirped before he could even open his mouth. He looked thinner, quieter. Even his coffee had been switched to decaf under the excuse of doctor's orders, despite the fact that no doctor had ever told him to give up caffeine. Eventually I managed to get him alone on the back porch. It was barely 30 degrees outside, but we pretended we just needed some fresh air. He looked sideways at me with that familiar spark still hiding in his eyes and smiled faintly. "My checkbook's been on a diet, kiddo." I asked what he meant. "The bank statements used to come to Maple Ridge," he said. "Now everything's paperless, and Braden keeps all the passwords." He'd asked to see his accounts twice. Both times Braden had simply clapped him on the shoulder and replied, "That's what you've got me for." I walked back inside and calmly asked Simone if, after the holidays, we could all sit down together and review Dad's finances. Before she could answer, Braden appeared as if he'd been listening from the next room. "Families don't need lawyers, Amber. Unless you're accusing somebody." Notice what happened there. I asked about bank statements. He introduced the word lawyers. Then, right on cue, Simone burst into tears, talking about how nobody appreciated the person who stayed behind to make all the sacrifices. Dad, because he was a decent man, and decent men often make the easiest hostages, rested a hand on my arm and quietly said, "I'm fine, kiddo. Don't start a war at Christmas." So I let it go. Looking back now, that was the moment I realized the battle had already started. I just hadn't been invited to it. Right on cue, Simone burst into tears, talking about how nobody appreciated the person who stayed behind to shoulder all the responsibility. My father, because he was a decent man, and decent men make the easiest hostages, rested a gentle hand on my arm and said quietly, "I'm fine, kiddo. Don't start a war at Christmas." So I didn't. On January 6th, I signed another 13-week nursing contract in Texas. I've signed countless documents throughout my career, but that one turned out to be the most expensive signature of my life. By February, the Sunday phone calls had changed completely. They no longer felt like conversations. They sounded rehearsed. Had enough. I took 4 days off between shifts without telling anyone and flew home, my own little ambush of love. Simone opened the door looking genuinely surprised, but recovered almost instantly. "Oh no, you just missed him. He's on an overnight fishing trip with the VFW boys." "Bad timing, sweetie. Fishing in Ohio." In February. Even as she said it, the lie sounded ridiculous. I drove to Dad's house on Maple Ridge anyway. Frost covered the overgrown lawn, the mailbox overflowed with unopened mail, the curtains were pulled tightly shut, and the whole place felt like it was holding its breath. On my way out of town, I stopped for fuel and ran into Earl Prescott, my father's oldest friend. 75 years old, Earl had run the Prescott Funeral Home for 4 decades before handing it over to his sons. He'd buried half of Cedar Falls and cried for most of them. He looked at me with genuine confusion. "Moses hasn't been to a VFW meeting in 3 months, honey. We figured he'd moved in with you." My stomach dropped. Not only hadn't Dad gone fishing, he hadn't attended a single meeting. I called Simone immediately from the petrol station. She didn't even hesitate. "Oh, not the VFW crowd. His other friends. You don't know them." One lie stacked neatly on top of another like firewood. I flew back to Texas carrying a knot in my stomach, and 3 days later Simone sent me a photograph. Dad sat in an armchair wearing a thin smile while the caption read, "Dad's doing great. Stop checking up on us." I stared at that photo for a long time. There was one tiny, ordinary detail hiding in the background that wouldn't make sense until 5 months later. When it finally did, it changed the way I looked at every picture she'd ever sent me. My contract ended during the first week of May 2026. And I returned to Columbus determined to drive straight to Cedar Falls without warning and refused to leave until I saw my father. Before I'd even unpacked, my phone rang. It was June Hetler, a nurse I'd worked with years earlier on the medical surgical floor. 58 years old, sharp as a lancet, and the kind of woman who noticed everything while judging almost nothing. She'd recently started working at a long-term care facility called Crest Haven Manor, about 170 miles from my apartment. Her voice was unusually careful. "Amber. We've had a resident here since March who asks every nurse on every shift if they know a nurse named Amber. He says she's his daughter." I couldn't speak. June continued gently. "His name is Moses Dawson." "Honey, is that your father?" I stood frozen in my kitchen with my keys still in my hand. No one, not Simone, not Braden, not anyone, had ever mentioned the words nursing home. As far as I'd been told, my father was comfortably eating pot roast 15 minutes from his own house. Before hanging up, June said one final sentence that sent me straight to my car. "Amber. He doesn't present like someone who belongs in long-term care. He presents like somebody misplaced him." I never called Simone. I never called Braden. Some conversations happen over the phone. Others happen in person, in broad daylight, with paperwork spread across a table. I grabbed my keys and left. Before I tell you what I found inside that building, let me say something to anyone with aging parents. Ask them today, kindly, over a cup of coffee. Who holds your power of attorney? Have you looked at your own bank statements this month? Not because you suspect someone, but because you should know. It's the one question I didn't ask soon enough, and it cost my father almost everything except his life. If this story is hitting home, take 2 seconds to subscribe, because what my father did after he walked out of that nursing home deserves witnesses. The 3-hour drive felt endless. Every mile I forced myself to think like a nurse, because if I'd let myself think like a daughter, I would have driven straight into a ditch. Crest Haven Manor sat at the end of a county road beneath a faded sign with 2 burned-out letters. The smell hit me before the front door even closed behind me. Cheap disinfectant struggling to cover something older and far more permanent. A call light blinked endlessly down the corridor while no one came. A television talked to a row of empty chairs. Instinct took over. I counted staff the same way I'd done on every hospital ward I'd ever worked. One exhausted nursing aide was covering an entire wing that needed at least 4. The medication cart sat locked in the hallway at 11 o'clock in the morning, while the 9 o'clock medications were still marked as pending. Before I'd seen my father, I already knew something was terribly, unforgivably wrong. I don't tell you any of this to shame the nursing aides. Understaffed people can't pour from an empty building. I tell you because my father had been living there for 10 weeks while my sister filled social media with posts about how family is everything. Dad was in a shared room at the end of the east wing, the second bed beside a window that didn't even open. My father, Moses Dawson, the man who once carried an engine block across a workshop floor through nothing but stubborn determination, looked at least 15 pounds lighter. Gray stubble covered his jaw, and he wore a shirt I didn't recognize that hung on him like a borrowed apology. But when the door opened, his eyes lifted, and they were still his eyes, sharp, clear, and completely present. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking, and what he said hurt far more than tears ever could. "Took you long enough, kiddo. They told me you knew. Told me you signed off on all this." In that instant I realized they hadn't only hidden him from me, they'd hidden me from him. Each of us had been told the other had agreed to everything. We spent the next hour unraveling 7 months of carefully woven lies, and every thread led back to the same 2 people. His flip phone hadn't broken at all. Simone had taken it, claiming she wanted to protect him from scam calls. Neither of the smartphones I'd mailed had ever reached his hands. He hadn't known they even existed. The 4 letters I'd written never made it past whoever collected his post. Back in March, Braden had told him he only needed to leave the house for 2 weeks while they repaired the guest room floor. 2 weeks became 3, then 4, and eventually the answer stopped altogether. One day he found himself standing in a hallway at Crest Haven with a roommate named Gus who spent every night yelling at the ceiling. All the while, they kept telling him I already knew, that I was too busy, that the nurse daughter couldn't spare time for her own father. He pulled a torn corner of an old envelope from his wallet where my previous mobile number was written in faded pencil, the only piece of me they hadn't been able to confiscate. But the hallway telephone required a staff member to dial the call, and at Crest Haven, available staff were almost mythical. Instinct took over. I asked him today's date, the month, the president, then had him count backwards from 100 by sevens just to watch him roll his eyes at me. "It's Tuesday," he sighed. "I'm in purgatory, and your little quiz is still easier than one of Braden's mortgage pitches." Sharp as ever. There wasn't a single thing wrong with my father's mind, and that fact was about to change everything. Then he glanced toward the doorway, lowered his voice, and quietly said the sentence that turned my concern into something far colder. "Kiddo, whatever paper they used to put me in here, I never signed a second one." I walked straight to the administration office with my RN license number ready and my professional voice switched on. The administrator, a tired man wearing an oatmeal-colored tie, repeated the script he'd obviously been trained to deliver. Only the responsible party can authorize a discharge, and that responsible party is Mr. Braden Voss under the power of attorney. I asked one simple question. Does Mr. Dawson have any diagnosis of dementia, cognitive impairment, or legal incapacity on file? Silence. He clicked through the records. Nothing. Because no such diagnosis existed. My father had been admitted as a voluntary resident based solely on paperwork submitted under the power of attorney, supported by a vague letter claiming he needed help with daily living. A mentally competent adult is not a parcel to be stored away. He has every legal right to discharge himself. Full stop. I said it politely, then added, or we can call the long-term care ombudsman together and review every page of the intake file. I cleared my afternoon. It's remarkable how quickly paperwork appears when someone mentions a state official. 20 minutes later my father sat at the administrator's desk and signed his own discharge papers with his healed right hand. Low, steady, deliberate. The capital M leaned left exactly the way it had since 1974. "First thing I've signed in 6 months," he smiled. "And it's a jailbreak." June hugged him on the way out and quietly slipped a packet of biscuits from the staff room into his jacket like contraband. The administrator reminded us the facility would notify the power of attorney by recorded mail. "Fine," I replied. "Post takes days." Somewhere beyond the county line, Dad watched the fields roll past the window and spoke so softly I almost missed it. "They think they've filed me away, kiddo. Let's not correct them just yet." I settled him into my apartment in Columbus. The sofa folded out into a proper bed. His blood pressure medication was refilled. I brewed him real coffee. Fully caffeinated, doctor's orders be damned. The following morning we went straight to the bank because Moses Dawson was still the legal account holder, and account holders have the right to see their own statements. The printout was 11 pages long. Dad read every line the same way he'd once diagnosed broken engines, slowly, carefully, and twice before saying a word. He never swore. He didn't have to. Between November and March, $187,000 had vanished from his accounts. $46,000 was labeled care expenses for a man surviving on instant mashed potatoes in Crest Haven. $89,000 had been wired to a company called BV Capital LLC. You can probably guess whose initials those were. Another $52,000 had gone to service the mortgage on a Florida condominium Simone, and Braden bought in 2022 when prices peaked. When the numbers stopped, just $25,000 remained. A lifetime of honest work. A quiet man's entire fortune. Stripped away in a single season. Tucked behind the bank statements was something even worse. A courtesy copy of a $150,000 home equity line of credit application against the Maple Ridge house. It was still pending approval, signed Moses Dawson, and dated April 14th. On April 14th, my father was sitting 170 miles away in a nursing home, asking every nurse he met if they knew where his daughter was. That night I called Simone. Call. One chance. Kept my voice calm. "Tell me your side. I'm listening." Her answer told me everything about who she'd become. "You were never really part of this family, Amber. Don't you dare lecture the one who stayed." That was the moment we stopped asking family for answers and hired someone whose entire profession revolved around paperwork. Patricia Whitfield, 61 years old, an elder law attorney with reading glasses hanging from a silver chain and a handshake that felt like a filing cabinet snapping shut. Her office smelled faintly of toner and lemon drops. She listened to every word without interrupting, then leaned back and delivered the sentence that made my father admire her instantly. "Documents don't cry, Mr. Dawson. That's why I like them." From that moment, everything happened legally, methodically, and in exactly the right order. First, Dad signed a notarized revocation canceling every power of attorney in existence, copies delivered to the bank, the county recorder, and every institution that had ever relied on it. Second, Patricia filed a signature dispute with the Hellick lender, freezing the application before a single pound, or in this case, a single dollar, could move. The house was still untouched. Third came a report to Adult Protective Services and a fraud affidavit with the bank, both of which start legal clocks that even the smoothest liar can't stop. Then Patricia explained the real challenge. Civil recovery is straightforward. Criminal intent is harder. He'll claim your father authorized everything verbally. Men like him always do. Buried deep inside the bank's records was the piece we hadn't known existed. A second power of attorney granting full financial authority, notarized on January 12th, the very document my father swore he'd never signed. Patricia slid it across the desk. "For criminal charges," she said quietly, "it helps enormously if they use a forged document again in public, somewhere witnessed. Fraud hidden in a drawer becomes a lawsuit. Fraud performed before an audience becomes a conviction." My father studied the page for a long silent minute, tracing the fake loops of a signature that carried his name but none of his hand. Then he looked up and calmly asked me to bring him his Army discharge papers. 2 days later, we drove back to Cedar Falls on a Tuesday morning while Braden was busy selling someone else a 30-year mortgage. My old key still opened the back door of the Maple Ridge house. Sometimes oversights are gifts. The stale air inside felt like an insult. File drawers in the den stood open and ransacked. Mum's suitcase lay half unpacked on the guest bed, her jewelry box beside it, completely empty. On the mantel, Carol's little brass clock sat frozen at some forgotten hour because no one had wound it in 7 months. Dad stood silently in the middle of his own living room, looking less like the owner than a visitor wandering through a museum of his former life. 7 months, he whispered. "The house doesn't even smell like mine anymore." Then he disappeared into the bedroom, knelt carefully beside the bed, and pulled out the old Army footlocker he'd kept since the 1970s. It was still locked, the one thing Braden had never managed to open. To a man chasing money, an old soldier's trunk looks like worthless furniture. Inside, everything remained exactly as Dad had left it decades earlier, squared away with military precision. His original D-214 discharge papers, signed at 22 years old. The original deed to the Maple Ridge house. His medals wrapped carefully inside a faded handkerchief, and one worn envelope in my mother's neat handwriting addressed simply, "For Moses when I can't say it myself." He didn't open that letter. Not yet. Instead, he carried the entire footlocker into the kitchen, the same kitchen where every important family decision had ever been made, and placed the forged power of attorney beside his Army discharge papers. Then he grew very, very quiet. I've learned to pay close attention when quiet men become quieter. 2 documents lay side by side across that kitchen table, created 52 years apart. On the DD-214 from 1974, the capital M in Moses leaned sharply to the left like a man walking into a strong wind. The crossbar of the T in Dawson stretched well beyond the letter, ending in the same distinctive tail it always had. The ink pressed firmly into the paper. "I sign like I mean it," Dad often joked. But the signature on the second power of attorney, dated January 12, 2026, looked completely different. Perfectly rounded. Even. Blight. Every letter behaved better than either of us ever had. Dad tapped the forged signature with one finger. "That's prettier than anything I've ever written. Even before I broke my wrist." But the handwriting wasn't what killed the forgery. The date was. The day after we brought him home, Dad signed paperwork making me his healthcare contact, allowing me to request every medical record. Those records showed that on January 12th, from 9 a.m. until 11:30 a.m., he was inside the orthopedic clinic undergoing hardware checks under light sedation, annealed in by medical staff at every stage. Yet the notary stamp on the forged power of attorney claimed he signed it at 10:15 a.m. in an office 20 miles away. A sedated man cannot legally sign paperwork in another town at the same time he's sitting in a hospital examination room. The document hadn't merely lied. It had exposed itself. Dad leaned back in his chair, and I watched something shift across his face. The grief that had haunted him for months quietly clocked out. And in its place, a decision finally clocked in. "Dead men don't sign papers," Dad said quietly. He frowned. "What does that mean?" He looked at the forged document lying on the kitchen table and gave the faintest smile. Their notary friend stamped a ghost, kiddo. Mom had been resting on the mute button since the moment I answered. We'd agreed the trap needed 2 more days buried before anyone disturbed the ground. Whatever Dad had just said was meant for Sunday. Simone would hear it standing in front of the entire town. "And so will you." I unmuted the call and forced my voice to sound small and shaken. I just need some time. I'll be there Sunday for the memorial." Simone's final instruction before hanging up was delivered with the same icy certainty she'd used all her life. "Fine. But don't you bring some lawyer to a funeral, Amber. Have some class." "Ma'am," I replied softly. "Understood." They spent Saturday exactly the way people like them always do. By 9 o'clock that morning, Simone had already posted a black and white photo of Dad on Facebook. "Rest easy, Daddy. Your girl was with you until the very end." A broken heart emoji. 200 reactions before lunch. Casseroles promised in the comments. Candle emojis from women who had sung beside my mother in church. "With you until the end." The end of what? His bank account. And that's when I finally understood the photograph she'd texted me back in February with the caption, "Dad's doing great. Stop checking up on us." It was the same armchair. The same wall. The same clock frozen at 7 minutes past 4. The exact same 7 minutes past 4 shown behind the new memorial photo. Dad was even wearing the same shirt. Every so-called proof of life she'd ever sent me had come from one afternoon. One staged photo session carefully cropped and rationed out over months like leftovers. Dad had been gone from that house since March. The photographs simply hadn't caught up yet. While Simone collected sympathy online, Braden got to work in the real world. Our neighbor on Maple Ridge, Dottie Crayons, who had watched that street for 40 years, called me sounding confused. "There's a van at your daddy's place. A man's drilling out the locks." Saturday. Before the funeral. Before they'd even pretended to bury him, they were changing the locks on his house. Patricia quietly added Dottie's time-stamped phone call to a folder that was already becoming alarmingly thick. June called too. Someone had contacted Crest Haven asking for copies of Dad's records, for the estate. The estate. The body wasn't even cold. Mostly because it was sitting at my kitchen table eating a BLT and asking for more bacon. Dad took every update with remarkable calm. That evening he polished his good black shoes until they shined, pressed his only dark suit, and hung it neatly on the bedroom door. "Every man should look sharp at his own funeral," he said with the faintest grin. Sunday arrived. 60 folding chairs. 1 closed casket. And my sister walked through the doors wearing brand new shoes and carrying a leather folder. The VFW hall looked exactly as Earl had planned. American flags stood proudly at the front beside the brass honor board. Rows of folding chairs stretched across an old wooden floor that seemed to creak confessions out of anyone who crossed it. At the front sat a borrowed closed casket from the funeral home's showroom. No one questions a closed casket at a memorial because no one wants to. Beside it rested a framed photograph of Dad in his 1972 Army uniform, standing as straight and confident as sunrise itself. And everywhere, lilies. God help me, lilies everywhere. The hall filled quickly. Veterans in their caps. Neighbors from Maple Ridge. Ladies from Carol's church carrying foil-covered casseroles. June slipped quietly into the back row. Patricia took a seat in the corner, her briefcase resting across her knees like a patient old housecat that knew exactly when to wake up. Dad and I waited in the storage room behind the stage. Hidden behind a side door with only a narrow gap in the hinges giving us a view of the room. Close enough to hear every chair scrape across the floor. My job was simple. Stand in the darkness, keep hold of the folder containing the truth, and breathe steadily. I'll be honest, I was terrified. My hands were freezing. Dad's weren't. Simone entered looking every inch the grieving widow from a magazine cover. A brand new black dress with the tags barely removed. New shoes. A tissue perfectly positioned in her hand. Tears appeared whenever someone looked at her and disappeared the moment they looked away. Braden worked the room like the salesman he'd always been, gripping shoulders, accepting condolences as if they were deposits into an account. His own folder tucked neatly beneath one arm. Naturally, they claimed the front row. At exactly 2 o'clock, Earl stepped to the podium, cleared his throat with quiet ceremony, and spoke the sentence we'd built the entire trap around. Before we share our memories of Moses Dawson, the family has asked to say a few words regarding his affairs. His affairs. They had requested that themselves earlier that morning. Lamb's volunteering for the spit. Braden rose without hesitation and walked to the podium the way men like him walk toward everything they believe already belongs to them. He placed both hands on either side, bowed his head for exactly the right amount of time, looked out at the packed hall and began. Moses was family. And family honors a man's final wishes. Then Braden opened the folder and slowly produced it. A heavy document on cream paper with a blue backing, the kind designed to impress before a single word is read. Moses had a will drawn up this past April, he announced. In it, he leaves his home on Maple Ridge Road, his accounts, his truck, everything to his daughter Simone and to me. He paused for effect before adding, signed April 20th, 2026. The room didn't erupt. Shifted. 60 wooden chairs creaked at once as 60 people straightened in disbelief. Doreen muttered the same way she did about late tomatoes and bad men. And heads slowly turned across the hall because everyone there had listened to Moses Dawson brag about his nurse daughter for over 30 years. This arithmetic simply didn't fit the man they knew. Braden should have stopped there. Braden had never stopped anywhere in his life. He raised one hand for silence, found me standing against the back wall exactly where we'd planned, and slowly read the next sentence. And to my daughter Amber I leave nothing. For reasons she knows. For reasons she knows. He smiled as he read a dead man's supposed cruelty to a room filled with that dead man's oldest friends. That smile became the most expensive thing he would ever wear. In the corner, Patricia calmly unlatched her briefcase without the slightest hurry. At the podium, Earl leaned toward the microphone with the gentle patience of a man who had buried half the town. April 20th, you said? He asked softly. Strange date for a signature. At that exact moment the side door clicked open. I watched 60 people hear that sound before they turned toward it. But let me hold that door closed for one more moment, because you need to know what happened the night before. Saturday, just before midnight, my kitchen table looked like an engine laid out for rebuilding. Every document, every record, every plan sat neatly in front of us. My old instinct made one final attempt to stop it all. We can still hand everything to the police on Monday, I told Dad. Quiet. Clean. No audience. He sat silently for a long moment before answering, almost gently. Simone told you that you'd get nothing. Let's see what nothing looks like when it stands up and walks. Then he gave me the real reason for everything. Kiddo, they didn't steal my savings. Savings can be rebuilt. I built them once with a wrench. They stole my voice. They told this town I needed storing away. They told my own daughter I didn't want her. They told me my own mind couldn't be trusted. A man's voice is about all he's got left at 74. And I'm taking mine back in front of everyone they lied to. That was the whole war, explained in one quiet speech while standing in my kitchen wearing nothing but an old undershirt. So we agreed on his rules. No shouting, no accusations, no dramatic speeches. I would simply carry the folder containing the bank statements, the revocation of the power of attorney, the medical records, and his army discharge papers, and we would let the documents speak for themselves. Paper had been used as the weapon against him. Now paper would become justice. Sunday afternoon, at exactly 2:17, the thin line of light beneath that side door grew brighter. My father's hand turned the knob, and 60 people were about to witness the shortest resurrection in Ohio history. The door swung open, and Moses Dawson walked into his own memorial service wearing a dark suit pressed razor-sharp, polished black shoes, and the VFW pin on his lapel catching the afternoon light. He didn't hurry. Moses Dawson had never hurried for anyone, and he wasn't about to start at his own funeral. One measured step. Then another. The old wooden floor announcing each footfall like a drumroll it had been saving for 60 years. The room fell apart in slow motion. A casserole dish slid off a side table and shattered across the floor, yet nobody even looked at it. One church lady crossed herself twice before collapsing back into her chair. Someone's oxygen tank let out a long whistle. In the back, June completely lost the battle and barked out one sharp laugh before covering her mouth with both hands. Doreen stared wide-eyed and declared to absolutely no one, "Well, I'll be damned," which, to everyone's knowledge, was the first time she'd ever said those words aloud. Simone didn't scream. She simply stood and stopped functioning. Her face turned as white as the lilies surrounding the casket, while 2 black trails of mascara slowly carved their way down her cheeks. Braden froze behind the podium with the forged will still raised shoulder-high in his right hand, perfectly displayed for 60 witnesses. And one lawyer. A salesman caught forever in the middle of his pitch. Dad reached the podium, adjusted the microphone with 2 fingers the same careful way he'd once tuned carburetors, glanced at the closed casket, and smiled. "Nice box, Earl," he said. "Little roomy for my taste." Then he looked straight into Braden's eyes and delivered the line he'd been saving all week, calm as sunrise. "Dead men don't sign papers, son. And they surely don't drink coffee." Braden reacted exactly the way every cornered salesman reacts. He tried to sell harder. "This is a sick joke," he shouted, his smooth voice finally cracking as every ounce of syrup boiled away. Nothing remained of Braden's polished charm except the burn. "He's not competent," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his own panic. "Look at him. This is elder confusion." He wandered away from his care facility. "She's manipulated him." Then his finger shot toward me at the back of the hall. "She took him. She's after the money. This is exactly why we were pursuing guardianship." It is a remarkable thing to watch a man drown while standing at a podium. 60 people had just watched my father walk across that room with the steady confidence of a colonel inspecting a parade ground. And now Braden was trying to convince everyone that the same man was confused and incapable. No one murmured in agreement. The hall fell into a different kind of silence, the kind that settles over a room when people stop being spectators and quietly become a jury. Simone chose a different strategy. She lunged toward sympathy instead. "Daddy, we thought Earl said." Then she spun toward Earl, her carefully rehearsed mask slipping for the first time. "You lied to me. You called me. You said he was dead." And there it was, spoken in her own voice before everyone present. She had been told her father had collapsed and supposedly died, yet she had never once asked to see him, never called the funeral home, never asked where his body was or how he had died. Instead, she had shown up carrying paperwork. Nobody forced that confession from her. Greed had simply spoken louder than grief. I walked calmly up the center aisle, every eye following me, and stopped a few feet from the podium. My voice stayed level, the same calm voice I use with families waiting outside operating rooms. "You called me at 6:30 the next morning," I said quietly. "The very first thing you talked about wasn't Dad. It was the will. You never once asked to see him." Behind me, I heard the pastor from my mother's church slowly rise from his seat, pick up his coat, and deliberately move 3 rows away from the Voss family. The room had begun choosing sides. Then Patricia stood, buttoned her jacket, and spoke for the first time. "Mr. Voss," she said politely, "may I see the document you just read to everyone?" What followed lasted barely 11 minutes, and I have never seen paperwork deliver justice so beautifully. Patricia laid each document onto the guestbook table one at a time, announcing each with the calm precision of someone reading tomorrow's weather forecast. First, a notarized revocation of every power of attorney previously granted, executed in May and already filed with the county recorder, the bank, and every relevant institution. Second, orthopedic clinic records from January 12, showing Mr. Dawson under light sedation from 9 a.m. until 11:30 a.m., with staff initials documenting every stage of treatment. Third, a power of attorney allegedly signed and notarized at 10:15 a.m. that very same morning at an office 20 miles away. A man cannot be sedated in one location while simultaneously signing legal documents somewhere else. She paused only long enough to place another document on the table. Fourth, bank records showing £187,000 withdrawn over 5 months, including £89,000 transferred to BV Capital LLC. She looked pleasantly at Braden. "I believe the B stands for Braden. I'm quite certain the V does not stand for victim." A ripple of restrained laughter swept through the hall. Patricia continued without missing a beat. Fifth, a home equity line of credit application against the Maple Ridge property, dated April 14, when Mr. Dawson was residing at Crest Haven Manor, over 170 miles away. Finally, she turned her attention to the forged will still clutched in Braden's trembling hand. "And this document is dated April 20th, during the same period Mr. Dawson remained at Crest Haven. Facility intake logs confirm he received no visitors that entire week. So perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone present exactly who witnessed this will." She gently tapped the signature page. "There are 2 witnesses. One of them is a loan officer employed in your own office." Every head in the hall slowly turned toward the 4th row, where a pale man sat frozen with a casserole balanced awkwardly across his knees. His face drained of color as he whispered, "Braden, you told me it was just routine estate paperwork. You said it was only a formality." In that single sentence, he dismantled his own testimony before anyone had asked a question. Braden made one final desperate attempt. Nobody consented to being set up. Nobody agreed to any of this. Patricia smiled faintly. "No one recorded you, Mr. Voss. You voluntarily read a forged will into a microphone before 60 witnesses during a public memorial service that you personally requested time to address." Right then, the rear doors opened, and 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office stepped quietly inside, exactly as Patricia had arranged with the fraud unit 3 days earlier. There was no dramatic tackle. No handcuffs snapping shut in front of the lilies. Real life is almost never that theatrical. It's quieter than television, and somehow far more devastating. The deputies walked calmly up the aisle with the measured confidence of men who already knew how the story ended. The older deputy stopped beside Braden and spoke in an even voice. "Mr. Voss, we'd like you to accompany us to answer some questions regarding a bank fraud investigation and several disputed legal documents. The bank has already frozen the line of credit and referred the matter for investigation. It won't take long before the bank starts asking questions," one of the deputies said evenly. "Bank fraud has a way of becoming a federal matter. You could watch every stage of Braden's collapse play across his face because a salesman only owns so many masks, and he reached for every one of them in less than 10 seconds. First came outrage. "This is a family matter," he snapped. The deputies didn't even blink. Then came charm. "Gentlemen, there's obviously been a misunderstanding. Let's step outside and talk this through." Nothing. Finally, the last mask, the only honest one, appeared. The beggar. He turned toward my father, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice climbed into panic. Moses, I'm family. I was going to pay it all back. Every penny. It was an investment. I was growing it for you. For your retirement. My father looked at him the way he'd always looked at an engine someone insisted wasn't broken. Calm, methodical, and quietly disappointed. "You had my checkbook for 7 months, son," he said. "The only thing you grew was my funeral." Nobody laughed. The entire hall simply exhaled. 60 people breathing together. The sound of a town quietly closing a ledger that had been open far too long. Then Simone finally broke. "I want to tell this part honestly because, despite everything, she's still my sister." She collapsed into the front row chair as though someone had cut her strings. For one brief moment, just one, the performance disappeared and the real woman looked out. "We were drowning, Daddy," she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "The condo. The credit cards. Everything." Braden said it was temporary. It was only supposed to be temporary. I believed that part. I still do. Most disasters begin exactly that way. A small leak that everyone promises they'll fix tomorrow. But sympathy never survives long when someone refuses to take responsibility. And Simone proved why with her very next breath. She turned toward me, tears streaking her face, anger replacing guilt. "But you made it worse, Amber. If you just stayed out of it, nobody would ever have known." There it was. Not "I'm sorry." Not "what have we done." Just the bitter regret that they'd been caught. I looked at my big sister, the one who had taught me to ride a bicycle, curled my hair before prom, and called me at 6:30 one morning to tell me I was getting nothing, and I answered with the calmest sentence I'd spoken all day. "You called before sunrise to tell me I'd receive nothing." I'm the only person leaving this room with everything I walked in with. The deputies gently stepped forward. Braden walked between them, still trying to explain interest rates and investment strategies to men wearing sheriff's badges, while my father moved back to the microphone one final time. He rested one hand on the borrowed casket and addressed his own memorial service. "Folks, I apologize for the rehearsal," he said with the faintest smile. "But you needed to see this. Not because I'm special. Because next time it might be your house, your children, your paperwork. Check your documents while you're still above ground." From the back of the hall, the pastor quietly answered, "Amen." It was spoken at the memorial service of a man who was very much alive, and my father later admitted it was one of the proudest moments of his life. Outside, the late afternoon sun washed over the gravel car park as 2 county patrol cars waited with their doors open. The deputies settled Braden into the back seat of the first vehicle, and before the door had even closed, he was already asking about his phone call, already rehearsing the next version of the story he planned to sell. Simone walked toward the second car under her own power. She wasn't being arrested that afternoon, but investigators had questions, and every step she took in her expensive new shoes caught awkwardly in the gravel. That uneven clicking sound has stayed with me ever since. To this day, it is filed in my memory under one word: consequences. Just before she reached the car, she stopped and turned around. For the first time that entire day, through the forged will, the memorial, my father's return, and everything that followed, she looked at our father instead of what he owned. Dad walked over at his usual unhurried pace and stopped an arm's length away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform for the neighbors gathering on the church steps behind us. He simply repeated the words he'd whispered 2 days earlier into the muted phone while coffee steamed across my kitchen table. "You buried the wrong man, sweetheart." That was it. The sentence he'd waited 48 hours to deliver face to face. Simone opened her mouth, but whatever words she'd hoped to find never arrived. The deputy gently closed the car door with that soft, unmistakable government click. From inside the other patrol car, Braden was still talking, his muffled voice spilling through the glass, still trying to negotiate, still trying to explain, still believing there was one more sale left to make. "Moses! Moses!" Braden shouted as the deputies guided him toward the patrol car. I stepped beside my father and called back in the same calm tone you'd use at a motorway toll booth. "You were right about one thing, Braden. Somebody's finally out." The patrol cars pulled away, leaving only the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. Earl wandered over carrying 2 cups of church lady coffee, surveyed the empty car park with quiet satisfaction, and grinned. Best service I ever ran. 10 out of 10. I'd bury you again. Dad snorted, unpinned the lily boutonniere Earl had insisted he wear, laid it gently on the borrowed casket as it was wheeled back toward the van, and said, "Give these to somebody who's actually dead. I've got a house to unlock." And that, my friends, is how my father attended his own funeral, cleared his own name, and still made it home in time for the evening news, which for once had nothing to say about him. That same evening we returned to Maple Ridge with a locksmith of our own choosing, complete with an invoice and receipt because, in our family, we keep records now. Dad walked past every drawer Braden's crew had searched, crossed the living room without a word, and wound my mother's brass clock before he even took off his suit jacket. The ticking returned, filling the silent house, and for the first time in months it felt as though the home, and perhaps my father himself, had started breathing again. Since you've stayed with me this far, you've earned the final accounting. Braden was charged with 2 counts of forgery, for the power of attorney and the forged will, along with theft from an elderly person and falsifying a loan application. His mortgage license was suspended within weeks and permanently revoked by the autumn, a professional death sentence no one holds memorial services for. BV Capital LLC was dissolved by the court-appointed receiver. Between bank restitution and recovered assets, my father reclaimed £141,000 of the £187,000 they had taken. The home equity loan never moved beyond the frozen application stage, and the Maple Ridge house remained untouched. Patricia transferred everything into a properly protected living trust with safeguards Braden couldn't have bypassed even if he had actually possessed the law degree he liked people to assume he had. Simone accepted a plea agreement. Her solicitor was sensible, and for once her tears reached the audience that mattered. She received 3 years probation, a restitution schedule, and 300 hours of community service. The judge, whose sense of humor was somehow drier than my father's, assigned every one of those hours to a nursing home, where she now empties bedpans and reads to residents whose own families rarely visit. People often ask whether I've forgiven my sister. I tell them exactly what I told her 8 weeks later through the glass at the probation office. She looked smaller somehow, without the mascara, without the performance, and quietly asked, "Did you come here to gloat?" "No," I answered, and I meant it. I slid an envelope across for the officer to pass through. Inside was my mother's letter from the footlocker. At the bottom, beneath her handwriting, Dad had added one line in pencil. "Your mother said don't go quiet. That part was for you too. Pay it back. Then start over." Simone read it twice. Something shifted in her face that I hadn't seen since long before Braden entered her life. Whether that change lasts is her story, not mine. What I offered through that glass wasn't reconciliation. It was a boundary. When the restitution is paid and the counseling is real, you know where I live. Until then, you get exactly what you offered me at 6:30 that morning. She nodded once. It was the first honest agreement we'd reached in years. As for the rest of us, Dad is back at the VFW every Thursday, and he and Earl have accidentally created something of a county tradition. Once a month they host a free seminar called Papers While You're Breathing. 2 old veterans, a folding table, free coffee, and practical advice about powers of attorney, wills, suspicious signatures, and how to protect yourself before someone else decides to protect your money instead. 11 people came the first month. By the third, they were setting up extra chairs, and one woman from 2 towns away stood up with tears in her eyes to say the talk had saved her own father from the very same kind of fraud. I accepted a permanent nursing position at a hospital in Columbus. No more 13-week contracts. Every Sunday I make the 2-hour drive home, and Dad still burns the bacon on purpose because he insists I've always liked it that way. It turns out being present isn't a debt you repay. It's a habit you choose. The brass clock still ticks on the mantel, and where my father once carried that torn scrap of paper with my phone number, he now keeps a single pressed lily inside his wallet. Every now and then he smiles, taps it gently, and says, "Best funeral I never had." If there's one lesson this whole journey taught me, it's this. The true measure of a person is never the balance in their bank account. It's whether their voice still matters while they're alive, and whether the people who claim to love them would rather protect their signature than profit from it. That's my story. One phone call at 6:30 in the morning. One forged signature. One old soldier who stood up at his own funeral and took back his name. If this story reminds you to check your parents' paperwork, or your own, don't wait. Do it this week while everyone is still above ground. And if you've lived through family betrayal, inheritance battles, or greed disguised as love, tell me your story in the comments. I read every one. If this journey stayed with you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and until next time, take care of the people who deserve your trust, and protect the signatures that protect your life.